With the end of the Cold War, some theorists such as Francis Fukuyama argued that the world had reached the end of history, effectively the endpoint of humanity's socio-cultural evolution and the final form of human government. However, in 1993, Samuel Huntington argued that whilst conflict between democratic and communist ideologies had ended, the world would move back to its normal state of affairs, which was cultural conflict. He argued that the primary basis of conflict in the future will be cultural and religious and between civilizations, rather than geographical entities like nation-states. He saw civilizations as being the largest grouping available for humans other than the species in total. With the increase in globalization, modernization and the power of the West, he argued that there will be greater tension and conflict, as other cultures and religions are not understood and become offended. One example of conflict due to the push of the West and modernisation was said to be the clash with Islamic civilization. Huntington argued that Islamic civilization would become frustrated and offended by the impact on their culture of modernisation and Western thinking. Religion and culture are seen by Huntington to be much less mutable than political and economic characteristics, which reduce the likelihood of compromise. Huntington further argues that non-West countries, by working together, are increasing their power to counter the West's dominance. As such, the West must seek to retain its domination of international institutions and military power. However, he does also argue that the West should gain a better understanding of other cultures and that different civilizations can learn to coexist. There are arguments against Huntington's thinking. Amartya Sen argues that Huntington has failed to take account of diversity within cultures, including diversity in the West, and so he conceives of these civilizations as being much more monolithic than they are. Paul Berman goes so far as to say there is no such thing as Western and Islamic civilizations, and in fact conflict occurs due to philosophy, despite the differences and similarities in cultural and religious identity. He cites the positive relationship between Saudi Arabia and the US as an example that shows the flaw in the argument. Berman's position is supported by Noam Chomsky, who further cites the example of Indonesia as a highly Islamic country and not in direct conflict with the West. More recently, the Avaz community, a global community that takes action on major issues, also critiques the notion of a clash of civilizations. They've made a video showing Islamic and Western images and identifying how both cultures can be portrayed in a negative light through an ethnocentric lens. In terms of what I think, Huntington's work was written over 20 years ago, and some of what he thought can be argued to have played out. 9/11 in 2001, then the War on Terror in Afghanistan and then Iraq could suggest Huntington was right. It has similarities to his thesis, except it's not two civilizations. In the case of 9/11, it was a group of people, Al-Qaeda, a jihadist movement, and while it has thousands of mujahideen, it's far from being a civilization. Huntington's thesis also supported what the Americans wanted to do. It was to their benefit to structure the argument in the way they did and give it a religious flavour. So it raises the question whether Huntington had an insight or whether Huntington constructed a myth which was then used by others. To my thinking, Huntington noted correctly the divisiveness of religion and culture, and how when others' views become dominant, others are not likely to simply give in to that. So to the extent where human beings interact and do not give space to finding understanding and coexistence, the likelihood is conflict. This can be due to political ideology or religious doctrine, between geographical communities or within geographical communities, between communities of interest or within communities of interest. So to my mind, harmony comes from understanding, finding our similarities and finding ways to coexist. And that has to be done before tensions are raised, because it's generally too late afterward. In Trevor Graham's Make Hummus Not War documentary, he looks at the conflict in Israel, Palestine and Syria, as well as each of their claims that they invented hummus and their shared love of it. He says, "The hummus war for me has raised some big questions. Despite their troubled history and animosity, people on both sides of this fight are essentially the same. Family and food are at the centre of their lives, and yes, hummus. Call me crazy, call me naive, but if hummus is a food of love, could it be the food of peace? If we are to create a myth, I think I would prefer that one."